My guest today is Father Gregory Pine, who is a lovable but formidable Dominican friar and one of the more recognizable voices ushering in a renewal of Thomistic thought inside and maybe even outside the church as well. He just completed his doctorate in dogmatic theology and has written several books and countless articles and reflections. Many of us know him from his contributions to Matt Fradd's Pints with Aquinas, as well as his own podcast, Godsplaining. I hope you enjoy listening to him as much as I always enjoy speaking with him. So you wanted to talk about freedom. That was the topic that has been on your mind. And I'm interested to hear what you've been thinking about it. For my part, I find this to be an extremely important topic because it appears a lot in our contemporary political discourse, especially when we fall into this trap of the post-19th century era of revolutions, where we are offered two political theories, basically, as the voting public. Either you have liberalism, in which freedom is held up to the highest degree as our supreme good, philosophically and classically that's called liberalism, but today that's often associated with conservatism or like the Republican Party. And then on the other side you have socialism, which would say that there are reasonable limits on freedom in the service of common good and centralization and sort of adhering to a single vision. But of course, both of them get a lot wrong about freedom. And the thing I struggle with is that Catholics fall into that trap, into thinking that it's one or the other. And then my Catholicism is up here somewhere it's somehow distinct from my political beliefs or my political theories, and the two don't intersect very much. So maybe a good place to start is to just kind of lay the groundwork and talk about freedom itself. What exactly is freedom? How would we define that? And maybe one extra question to that for me is it distinct from agency? Do they mean different things? I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've pushed record yet. Have you pushed record?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect. So I think that freedom is distinct from agency. I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll just say something about that last piece, and then you can see fit to direct the conversation in a meaningful direction.
Yeah.
But I tend to think of freedom as mature agency, or progressively mature agency. So, in my understanding, like I'm thinking here in terms of like theological anthropology. So we're made to the image and likeness of God. In rough kind of contours or rough outlines, that means that we have a mind with which to know and a heart with which to love, and that's patterned on God. So God is the source of that image. He is the pattern of that image. He is the end of that image. And we have the hope, the expectation that we'll be progressively assimilated to or conformed to God on the pattern of our knowing and loving. So you can know and you can love. That's just a capacity. You can exercise that knowledge and love. All right, that's an act. And that you can do so with God's own knowledge of himself and with God's own love of himself, such that by progressive stages, you come to abide yet more perfectly in God. And so our life's trajectory, our kind of wayfaring state, is characterized by progress, or like it's characterized by a progressive perfection of knowing and loving. And I think that freedom kind of tracks that. So freedom identifies a greater competence, a greater facility on the part of the independent, reasoner and lover to act in accord with his good. And so for that reason, it's no surprise that freedom is largely bound up with virtue, because you are free to do those things for which you are empowered or emboldened. And what is it that empowers or emboldens us as human beings? Well, virtue. Because virtue is a kind of strength whereby a particular power of the soul, here in this case we're talking about the intellect and the will, are stabilized and kind of like furnished with the appropriate resources such that they can act reliably and well for their whatever end, I suppose. So that's somewhat jargony, but I think about freedom largely in terms of the maturation of our agency.
Okay, so I like how you tied it to virtue, and we'll hopefully say a little bit more about that. In anticipation of this, I cracked open the Catechism and read a bit about what it said, and there are things that it says that are far more in line with what you just said. And obviously there's a lot we can say about it. So I'm not saying that there are things in there that contradict what you just said. But there are things in there that imply that freedom is something that is inherent. It's something that we're almost born with. And while I agree with that, as you said, it's also something that develops with and from virtue, right? So maybe a distinction that is helpful for me is we could say about the first created human beings in their paradisal state, Adam and Eve. They had freedom. They had the fullest capacity of freedom, right? And then through the fall, some might argue, based on the way that it's depicted in that story, that they gained a new horizon of freedom because now they could choose evil. Although they always could choose evil, but now maybe they had new knowledge and new things that they could choose that they didn't understand that they could choose before. But at the same sense, that there was a loss of virtue, or at least a loss of harmony with God there. So how do we reconcile this appearance that by growing in evil or being opened up to evil, there seems to be an increase of freedom there? Is that accurate, or are we missing something there?
Yeah, I think it's just two uses of the term freedom. So when St. Thomas Aquinas defines freedom or free choice or liberty, however you want to characterize it, he identifies two sources of it. So the first he calls the freedom of exercise, and that is in effect that you can choose whether or not to perform the act. All right, so like volition or nolition. And then the other he calls freedom of specification. And this is a really fascinating point. He says, on account of the fact that we are made for God, right, on account of the fact that our minds and hearts will never be satisfied with anything less than he who is universally true and universally good, we are not bound by any limited good, by any particular or peculiar good, because they're never going to correspond fully to our mind's inquiry and our heart's desire. They will satisfy us partially, but they will always leave us with further hunger and thirst. And so when he talks about freedom of specification, he says, on account of the fact, and this is the language of Yves Simon, who was a student of Jacques Maritain, he says, on account of the fact that we are superdetermined, to God that is, we are underdetermined with respect to, goods that we encounter here in this world. And so you're always free to see a particular good from this aspect or that aspect. So you might think to yourself, okay, imagine a situation in which I am practically constrained or practically bound to the choice of a particular good. Let's say that I've been wandering. I was doing one of these ultra marathons in the Sahara Desert, and I got off course, and I haven't had a drop of water for the past 4 days, and I am on the brink of madness. And then I stumble upon a reservoir of water in the desert, and I come up to the edge of it. You might think, I am bound to drink that water. Like, there is no other option but to drink that water. And yet, you aren't bound to drink that water, because maybe you said a prayer like, Lord, I will only drink the water that you offer me. And when you offer me that water, I will listen to the next word, which is pronounced by any sentient being, and I will do exactly what he or she says. But then you might say to yourself, this reservoir, I don't know if this is actually God's gift to me or if I just happened upon this in chance. Certainly, a sign from God would be more manifest and overt, like a helicopter flying overhead that dumped water on me. So maybe I shouldn't drink from this because that would actually to be getting out ahead of the divine sign. So, I mean, it's a little bit farcical, but you can imagine a situation in which you're not bound even by those limited goods, which would otherwise overwhelm your faculties. And so these would be the two sources of freedom, is I think how we think about it. And a lot of people, they just identify that with freedom. That's just your freedom. And to a certain extent, they're right. But then I think freedom in the fullest sense, a freedom for excellence. And here I'm using the language of Father Servais Pinckaers, who in his book Sources of Christian Ethics distinguishes between freedom of indifference, which would be like kind of license, and then freedom for excellence, which is this mature agency that I've described. So I think that when we talk about freedom for excellence, you might say, okay, having lived a life of virtue for however many years, you're no longer tempted by pornography, or you're no longer tempted by drug abuse, or you're no longer tempted by alcoholism, even though there are more clinical elements of some of those things, so and the reason for which you're no longer tempted is because I don't know, like you can't imagine a moral universe in which you would fall prey to those things because you've crafted your life in such a fashion over the course of the past several years that it's kind of unimaginable. So would we say that you are thereby less free? No, because you're more empowered, more emboldened, that is to say, like more capacitated and matured for the pursuit of the good. And because you can't be thrown for a loop in these ways, you're better able to live your Christian life. Like St. Thomas Aquinas, his brothers tried to tempt him to fall against the virtue of chastity. They introduced a prostitute into his room. He got up from his bed. He pulled a firebrand from the fire. He escorted the woman gently out of the room. He burned a cross on the door. He knelt by his bedside. And then he was clothed or like kind of girded in a belt of chastity by angels. And it said that facilitated his contemplative heights to which he soared later in life. And it actually, empowered his life of prayer and study, and then the contribution he subsequently made to the church's intellectual tradition. So it's like, if you're not troubled by these things, then you're in fact more free for the excellence that lies in store, which represents your particular vocation. So I think maybe it's just two aspects, but the one imperfect and the other perfect.
If you're a Catholic who is a leader in your profession and you're like me, you probably had some desire for more opportunities to network with other Catholic professional leaders in order to help each other grow professionally, spiritually, and economically. Because this is exactly what we're doing with FER's Network. We're mobilizing Catholic professionals and economic leaders into local crews so that they can better support one another in the hopes of building up something like a local Catholic economy. As they do so, they can better support their parish in a variety of ways. Imagine as a parish having a group of experts you can turn to for advice and support on business decisions that have to be made. This is why pastors participate in our crews as well. They get business mentorship while having the opportunity to build up leaders in their community. So if this sounds like a way to strengthen your local Catholic community or parish, consider becoming a member by visiting fishersnetwork.com. So what I hear is that there's this all-encompassing concept of freedom that some of these more distinct or applied versions of it can be understood. And the way that I did that was that there's our ability to simply choose to act. And as an analogy, since you obviously like elaborate analogies, let's say, I think some people perceive this as if we've been dropped in sort of a simulation, almost an arbitrary simulation that God has designed for us, and now we're supposed to do something, just like a video game. You've entered into sort of a video game world, one of these big adventure multiplayer kind of worlds, and you have to do something. You have to act. To not act, at least according to the Bible, is as heinous as to act in the wrong way, maybe even more so in some respects, right? So you have to do something, but you don't really know what to do. Right. And so you have freedom to act, you have freedom to make choices, to walk in a certain direction, to pick up items, to interact with other players or non-playable characters or whatever. But you definitely know there are wrong things to do. So there's the apprehension that's there. But the more you make the right decision, the more you are strengthened, the more you understand the world that you are inhabiting, and the more capable you are within that world, especially in your typical video game scenario where you level up, right? Your character becomes more powerful or has more items or more armor or weapons or whatever, and he can do more things or she can do more things and is therefore more free to act within that world. So that could be analogous maybe to how virtue enhances our freedom. So there's a kind of freedom that exists in the beginning where we have to act, we have to do something. But and then there's the kind where it's just enhanced through virtue over time. Both are kinds of freedom. I would have said that initial kind, that sort of that baby stage freedom is I would have used the word agency there, but I don't know if that's necessarily technically accurate. And that the other kind would be a more capital F freedom, the kind that gets associated with virtue and truth, the kind that our Lord references biblically about how the truth will set you free and things like that. Simultaneously, though, the way that God has set the stage for us, I can anticipate a lot of people saying, well, it's not a very nice thing for him to just drop us into this world, kind of set these arbitrary rules, punish us if we don't act, and then punish us for acting wrongly when maybe we didn't understand, we didn't know what to do. We found ourselves in this scenario that we didn't ask for. And if we do the wrong thing, we're going to get struck with a lightning bolt or saddled with an addiction to something we didn't understand was going to be bad for us or or what have you. So how does this relate to God's goodness and God's love for us, would you say?
Yeah, I think that I was having a conversation recently with a gentleman who was advancing the arguments for, well, a kind of problem of evil, one of many problems of evil, I suppose, on the basis of divine hiddenness. And this idea like, okay, believers say, or theists say, that God desires the salvation of his creatures, specifically of rational creatures, angels and men, and that salvation is in some way contingent upon our knowledge, or at least our belief in the Most High God. So it would seem to depend upon a revelation which is tailored to or calibrated to the understanding of those same rational creatures. And yet there are tons of people out there who don't believe. And it doesn't seem like they're choosing kind of contumaciously or obstinately against belief. It seems from their perspective like there isn't sufficient testimony to a revelation which would command assent. And so on the basis of this, how about we just get rid of the hypothesis that God exists and call it a day and say that the atheist, not the theist, is correct. So this is the argument, and that's just kind of broad contours, the argument that he was advancing. And I think it gets in a kind of existential way at the heart of the problematic that you just described. Namely, like, I think there's a fear that we haven't been furnished with sufficient information or with sufficient resources to actually do the job that we have been assigned, or the task that has been set before us. And then I think of that prayer that St. Augustine repeats at a variety of points in the middle of the Confessions. God, give what you will and will what you command. Is that right? God, give what you will and will what you command. Yeah, I think that's right. So God, give what you will and will what you command. No, I've got the order of it wrong. I'll come back to that after I've actually sorted it out. The basic idea is that God's commands correspond to our capacity, in the sense that God doesn't ask of us anything for which we ourselves are not capable, and that God furnishes us with what we need in order to carry it out. Part of what's mysterious about this thing is that we're not all responsible for the same, well, how would you describe it? Kind of recognition and reception of salvation, because to some is given more and to some is given less. Yeah. So with like our Lord Jesus Christ, for instance, there's a high degree of consent and cooperation that we see evinced with Our Lady. There is a high degree of cooperation that we see evinced with Saint Joseph, and down the line. But we're really responsible for responding to the graces which God gives in his predestinating love. And God loves us differently, right? God gives us different gifts. Now, mind you, he loves us all with the same love, and yet he accords to us genuinely different gifts. So he's accorded to you the gift of being Canadian. He has accorded to me the gift of being American. He has accorded to Gilles Emery the gift of being Swiss. And that sets the stage for how we're to live our lives and then how we're to respond to the divine call. Now, that's like a somewhat trivial example because it's not entirely clear how nationality contributes to salvation, but other things are more pertinent. Like the reason I go with Christ, Blessed Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph is because we're talking about grace here. So then when we get to the question of nature, like, have we been given enough? I think that you can pose various problems of evil along this line and say, like, what about people with defective agency? What about people who have never really been exposed to a humane environment, who have only ever known trauma and violence, whose lives have been cut short before such time as they were able to ... And I think here, again, I rely on revelation in the sense that God desires that all be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. And you can't explain creation, the whole dispensation of creation in a theistic context, without God willing it in some way for us, because he doesn't need it. Like it doesn't correspond to any lack or indigence on his part. So this whole creating of rational beings, namely angels and men, must in some way correspond to their glory, salvation. Otherwise, it's just nonsense. It's otiose, it's silliness, and it's, I don't know, even maybe a little bit cruel. Hard to say. But yeah, I think that's the way that you put it is, it's good, and it gets at the existential question, which is probably the most urgent.
As we orbit around this concept of freedom, we keep running into concepts of virtue and goodness itself. And I feel like we have to put some flesh on those concepts a little bit, because also if we're returning to this objection that we've just been put in something like an arbitrary simulation, I mean, how do we respond to this notion that it's arbitrary? Because we have the moral law imprinted upon our conscience. We have something like a memory of it. We have intuitions about how we ought to behave in the simulation or in this life that we've been given. Goodness itself isn't just an arbitrary standard. It's something that we are drawn to, right? And that almost lights our path as we go. So maybe give us a sense of like how goodness and virtue fit into this in response to any notion about the stage being set in an arbitrary fashion.
Yeah, I think, okay, so what would the believer say? How is the stage set? Well, he would say according to the divine wisdom and love. That we're not talking. So we're not talking about is what we're not talking about is we're not talking about a best possible world. St. Thomas entertains that question. Prima pars, question 25, article 6. He says, is this the best possible world? Response, no, because God could always create more instances of the good things that he has created. And, there's a sense in which he could improve upon each of those species. So each has a certain rank, but insofar as there's still a kind of quasi-infinite distance between each of these creatures and God, and there might be little cracks in the cosmic continuity, like God might be able to shoehorn in another excellent creature between us and angels. Hard to say. You can speculate about that. But yeah, God can improve upon this world. So he's not motivated by optimization or maximization. We've already established that from the fact that creation doesn't serve any purpose vis-a-vis the Godhead, right? It doesn't advance his beatitude because he subsists as beatitude. So, all right, this must be in some way, shape, or form a deliverance of the divine wisdom and love. But the problem with, citing that as the source is that you can't sound the depths of it because it's, with respect to our limited capacity, incomprehensible or super comprehensible. So then what type of argumentation can we deploy? This would be like, in the Thomistic setting, you can use arguments from fittingness. So you're not going to have strict demonstrative arguments as to why God does what he does, because in order to do that, you'd have to know the mind of God. CF, Romans 11, verses 33 through 36. Who has known the mind of the Lord, etc. But you can say to yourself, well, what might be the reasons for which? And can we project those? Can we draw some connections amongst things which have been revealed in sacred scripture, handed down in the tradition, and which we receive at present as beautiful, as wonderful, as contributing to our salvation? And the answer to that is yes. And we see a lot of that type of argumentation. Like, why did the Lord take human flesh? Well, because he wants to save us from our sin, but then we see how that's played out in every imaginable dimension. And I think that getting to the point of virtue, I think virtue helps us to come before the mystery with an upright disposition. Because if we come before the mystery with a kind of contemplative openness, I think we're more likely to see into the mind of God or to become more assimilated to the plan of his providence, both in its kind of notional aspect and in its practical aspect. Like we become agents of that providence. But if we come before the Lord as an accuser, it's like, why'd you do this and why'd you do that? And then I think we're less likely to wrest from his hands anything like a coherent response. Because it's like, Job 38, after 37 chapters of questioning, he comes and he says, hey, I got deeper questions for you still. So yeah, so there's something to be learned from that.
If we can continue to beat this analogy a little bit further, because it seems like it still has some life in it.
Yes.
I almost think of like when you put something through a system, or again, a simulation, or sort of like a computer circuitry, you input some data, or you input an electrical charge, and it goes through all the circuitry and it comes out the other side as something different than when it went in. I was trained as a computer programmer in college, and that's sort of like what you do. You develop these elaborate workflows of logic where something comes in the top and it goes through this flow chart and it hits all of these questions and these loops of logic and these algorithms. And then by the time it hits the bottom, it's turned into something useful. It's been organized. It's been stored in a database. It's been calculated upon or whatever. And I feel like to whatever degree you might sense that this world is arbitrary, at least it is achieving some sort of an end. So if you are that little piece of data, or if you're the character in the simulation, by the end, you're going to come out changed. And not merely because your path has been determined for you, but because you interact with the circuitry, or you interact with the world that's been created for you to determine what it is that you become. Now, you aren't solely responsible for that. And I think that there's a lot of confusion around how much freedom we actually have. And I want to get your response to that. But there are things that will happen to you, and that there are things that you will occur to happen, so that by the end you will have hopefully grown in virtue and in freedom and in goodness. So I want to get your sense of if we're still on the right track with that analogy, but also, just give me your reaction to some of that.
Yeah, some people are going to react negatively insofar as it sounds like we're submitted to or subjected to machine logic. The way that we escape that fear is with the recognition that this takes place within the bounds of divine providence. So maybe to get to the second of two parts first, I think that our freedom is often very thin, or the free contribution that we make in the pertinent moral situation is very slight. But I think that's part of its nobility, because more often than not, the contribution that we're making with our freedom isn't so much like an invention or a discovery as it is a kind of ratification. It's like, all right, you are the son of these parents. You are the citizen of this polity. You are the member of this church. And a lot of those things kind of go before you. And you don't have much control over what happens before the age of 7. Not much control over what happens between 7 and 18, and not much control over what happens afterwards. So where do we get off thinking that we're in the driver's seat? I think that a lot of our freedom can be expressed in the term consent. I'm thinking here of the book by Jacques Philippe, Interior Freedom, where he says, modern man is haunted by the fear that real life is elsewhere. And he says, it's not elsewhere, it's here and now. But in order to derive from it the fruit that is to be harvested, you have to consent to it. It's not to say like God is a traumatizer and he wants to really get you to like give yourself to the trauma. That's not it, because reality is not against you. Reality is for you. But in order to access that, you need to be able to say, all right, I abandon myself to this with the confidence that God is provident, that he is good, and that this is all a deliverance of his goodness. And I think a good way to focus that is, the doctrine of divine providence, that nothing falls without the bounds of divine providence, that God knows what transpires, that he orders all things strongly and sweetly unto the praise of his glory, that even if something seems to depart from his providence, he makes it such that it returns to him. So it might seem to depart by transgression, and he makes it return to him by, punishment or by mercy or by whatever else. So I think that keeping those two things in mind, we have a better sense of how, the analogy that you've been advancing in the last couple of questions has application, and how we're not ground under by that, or how our humanity isn't, kind of consigned to the morally neutral or the morally insignificant as a result.
Okay, there's a lot there. So what I hear you saying is that, because you hear this a lot in schools, especially with kids, is that like, be positive, you can do anything you want, you can be anything you want, you should go and change the world. And we hear platitudes like, make the world a better place than it was when you came into it, and that kind of thing. And what I hear you saying is that we don't really, there's a hubris in that. We don't have that much potential in the freedom that we have to make certain decisions, but it's more like we're cooperating with the currents of goodness and the invitations that maybe divine providence lays for us. Is that pretty accurate, would you say?
Yeah, I think that you just look at a lot of things statistically, and not everyone's going to become an astronaut, and that's okay.
Right.
The question is then, how do you package that for a 6-year-old? I think you package that by saying, you're precious, like you're precious, regardless of the circumstances of your conception and birth. You are willed, peculiarly and particularly by the Most High God. And he gives you graces which are peculiar and particular to you. And you're not necessarily going to be set apart from your peers by the accomplishments that you accumulate, but you are set apart from your peers insofar as you represent a distinct thought and a distinct choice of the Most High God. Now, in God, it's all one same thought and it's one same choice, but it's differentiated, and you are the testimony of that differentiation. So you're unrepeatable. You're unique. Insofar as you can tell forth something glorious, you can tell forth something saving, which you're uniquely suited to make manifest and communicable. And I don't know what that's going to look like. It'll probably be modest. It'll probably be humble. It'll probably be hidden. And that's awesome, because in the body of Christ, most things take place beneath the surface of the skin. And it's best that way. Otherwise, it'd be a monstrosity. If it were all, like vainglorious attempts to be surface level, then yeah. So yeah, I think that children have that communicated to them by their parents in ordinary situations, with whom they have a secure attachment. Just by like care, affection, time. I just don't think that we need to tell people that you are your accomplishments and that you can change the world in an outward or exterior fashion and to make of that a kind of goal, because I think that leads to resume padding and high stress at an early age. And then the perpetuation of compromised moral choices for the sake of, status or perceived elite, like rankings vis-a-vis one's peers that doesn't actually help you to find where you fit in the body of Christ.
Yeah, and certainly an excess of ambition or any of the measures that we might take to achieve those ends can easily lead towards vice, which will be a diminishment of freedom, and not to mention the goods around us and for ourselves. I had to laugh there a little bit because I was imagining you giving that lecture to a 6-year-old and then just being like, okay, yeah, it makes perfect sense. There you go.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, cool.
I was with you at the precious part, and then. So maybe I guess one of the questions I have then to try and understand how this applies to our lives and how we cooperate with the good and to what degree we exercise this freedom is talk to the situation of the person who didn't, as a 6-year-old, get those kinds of speeches and didn't have good guidelines, didn't have good examples in their lives, and ended up making some poor decisions. And those accumulated to the point where as a teenager or an adult, they've got some pretty serious vices or maybe even addictions at this point, to the degree where no amount of subtle cooperation, it would seem, would help untangle that mess, right? It seems to me, well, it would appear often to, I think, a lot of people that a heroic amount of will and freedom and choice and problem solving are necessary to fix that situation. And maybe that's why, to some degree, we don't have solutions in certain medical disciplines to actually help people escape these situations. So what does freedom look like to that person? How do they find freedom, would you say?
Yeah, so I think this is where the maturation model is helpful, because freedom says will a higher state, right? So freedom doesn't say once you've attained to this echelon of mature agency, then you're a good human being. Until such time, you're basically rubbish. No, it sets between your navigational beacons this kind of focus on maturation, which always entails healing and growth. And I think that's a super important thing for us to hear as Christians, is that healing and growth are just part of every Christian vocation. There's no point at which one can say, all right, I have healed enough, I have grown enough, thanks for that, moving on. Well, and the reason for which I know that to be true is that you described our original state in which it was easier for us to know the truth and to choose the good. And then we fell from that state, and as a result of which we suffer certain wounds in our nature. And we'll talk about ignorance in the intellect, malice in the will, weakness and concupiscence in our passions. And part of the whole drama of human life is being reconstituted in the life of virtue, which affects a kind of healing and growth beyond that woundedness, beyond, I think here of Pope Benedict XVI's exegesis of the Good Samaritan. So he talks about the man who fell in among robbers, having been despoiled of grace and wounded in nature, and how Christ, the Good Samaritan, finds him in his state of deprivation and then ennobles him through the ministrations of the church and the sacraments. And so for somebody in that state, I think what they need to hear is a gospel of hope. Say God can address your needs, right? God can address your sorrows. God can address your addictions, and he can heal them and he can grow them. Now, there might continue to be attachments to former ways of life, which will abide at the level of the body or the emotions or even the mind. But spiritually, you can be renewed, and that will bring with it the mind and the emotions and the body in due course. Like you can heal, you can grow, And as a result of which, you can mature in your agency, which is to say you can come into fuller possession of your freedom. So the church doesn't despair of you. Christ doesn't despair of you. Therefore, as its instrument, I don't despair of you. So in the words of America's youth, comma, quote, let's go.
I can hear, the if there are any pragmatists who watch my content, I doubt there are very many, but I think of my wife, for example. She has her intuitions are very pragmatic in nature. She doesn't spend a lot of time contemplating abstract concepts, and they want tools. They want strategies for how do I achieve these certain ends. So if we're thinking about something like addiction, like what are the steps here? Or if we're thinking about growth and virtue and the right exercise of my freedom, what are the steps? And maybe a way to narrow this question would be to say, for you as a Dominican friar, I don't know much about the vocation of a friar, but presumably there, as part of your formation, there are tools and there are strategies and there are insights that are shared with you and that you would probably revisit from time to time to help you grow in certain kinds of virtues. Is that the case? And if so, how would you share some of that insight in a very practical sense for the average layperson?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people are worried that there are like life hacks or shortcut strategies, which, were they to discover them, they would propel them on the course of their spiritual development. But seeing as they haven't come across them yet, they're just languishing here in this vale of tears. I think a lot of people use spiritual direction that way. They think to themselves, what I really need is a spiritual director, and that will turbocharge my spiritual life. And then they get a spiritual director and nothing changes. So I think that, like, here we can focus with renewed interest on the ordinary means of Christian kind of maturation, which would be prayer, sacrament, community of some sort. Ordinarily for a layperson, this would be marriage and family. But then it goes beyond that to certain intermediate institutions like your parish community or like a local charitable organization, whatever else. Penance, and then study of the faith. And so I think about it in terms of like nourishing your humanity with God, because God gives himself to us as the spiritual equivalent of food and drink. I mean, he gives himself to us in the Eucharist, right? And I think that we are often, we don't conceive of our life often enough in those terms, but like God wants you to feed on him. St. Augustine seizes upon this point when he's got this beautiful line in the Confessions where he's talking about, like he identifies Christ as the way, the truth, and the life, quoting from John 14, and he uses the nominative case, and then he shifts with the next words, like end food. He puts it in the accusative case so as to distinguish and not like muddy the scriptural waters. But like God gives himself as food, and he talks about how the Son of God mixes his divinity with human flesh so that we can precisely feed upon him. And so, I think that there's no silver bullet, if that's the right image that I'm trying to discover at this stage of the game. It's just showing up, right? But the good news is, to a lot of us, that sounds disappointing, because it sounds like the slog that we have undertaken for the past however many years is destined to continue indefinitely. But we should always undertake this with a renewed interest, again, and a renewed focus on the initiation of God. So it's like the Lord is the protagonist of this saving work, and he is attending to you. So in your attempts to attend to him, know that he goes before you, and that your efforts, your attempts would be impossible were he not to attend to you. And so I think that it gives us a kind of freedom, again, to be where we are, not to say like, hey, I'm doing just fine. Let me recline further in this Barca Lounger and just crack open another beer and get myself a yet more decorative koozie so that I can, rest the aforementioned beer on my well-established paunch. But it does mean that, like, the anxiety that we feel of having constantly to reinvent our spiritual life, it really needs to be banished. Like, we need to cover ourselves in the most precious blood of Jesus, bind and send to the foot of the cross the spirit of anxiety, the spirit of, auto-salvation, which would have us always and everywhere bound up with these types of thoughts. That's just the beginning of an answer, but I suppose I should stop.
I want to keep this question brief, or this topic brief, because it's a digression. But do you offer spiritual direction yourself? And what do you think of our current conception and practice of that in the church?
So I have a couple of spiritual directees, and those are long-standing relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things that I would have agreed to like 4 or 5, 6 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In the last 4, 3, 2 years, when people have asked, I will typically say the following. I'll say, I don't take on new spiritual directees.
Yeah.
That being said, I'm a priest, and I was ordained for you. So I'm always happy to talk to you about the Christian life. But my experience is that if you have a standing meeting, it's not always terribly fruitful. But if you have the open invitation to send me an email or give me a call when things come up that you would like help troubleshooting, I find that to be more fruitful and more targeted, more focused. So how about we do that? So in general, I think that most people don't need spiritual direction because I think that you can rely upon the ordinary means of Christian maturation, like the ordinary means of healing and growth, which the Lord puts at our disposal with such largesse. And yeah, I think that we need a kind of accountability, a kind of relational vulnerability. But I think that a lot of people find that in marriage or in friendship or in fraternity or in other established institutions.
I'm hearing that a lot, actually, to my surprise, because spiritual direction, the trajectory I took coming into the church and the distinct Catholic persuasion that I had come in through was big on spiritual direction. Like, you have to get a spiritual director. It can be a layperson, it can be your neighbor. Like, you just have to have a spiritual director. You have to be talking all the time and getting this advice. So almost as if, in the secular world, everybody needs a therapist. You should go into therapy. You should get a counselor. You should be talking about your thoughts and your feelings. It's kind of like the Catholic version of that was almost my perception of it. But more and more I'm hearing from priests that I trust that not everybody does need a spiritual director. And I think that that's shocking to a lot of people who are conditioned by this mentality that you have to be doing spiritual direction as a routine practice in the church. I don't know if you want to say more about that, but that is interesting to me.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add, just simply that sometimes it's helpful to hear again and again that you're not missing something essential to your spiritual growth. If you're baptized, you're confirmed, you're receiving the sacraments, you're praying, you're in committed relationships with virtuous people who encourage you in the life of faith, you're gonna be good. I think you're gonna be good.
Good. Yeah. Well, that's enough of all the practical application. Let's get back into the abstractions. Exactly. One question I had was, is freedom an end or a means to an end, or both even? And I don't know the answer to that, so I'm sincerely interested in how you would reply to that.
Yeah, I think because we've defined freedom in a variety of ways, I think the semantic range across which we've used it partakes of both end and means. Yeah. So what's the end? The end is God. Objectively speaking, the end is God. That's what we're hoping for. We want to get God, and we believe that we're capable of getting God. But even with respect to beatitude, we talk about objective and subjective beatitude. So objective beatitude being God, and then subjective beatitude being our partaking therein. So that means an engagement or a commitment on the part of the individual such that intellectually and volitionally there's a kind of enlightenment and embrace. And so we'll talk about the light of glory, whereby our faculties are strengthened, our powers are strengthened, so as to take in this vision and lay hold of it. And that God gives himself kind of as the medium through which, that's improper language, but there's nothing in between us and God in the vision and embrace of God. So that's something that registers in our humanity. There's a created element to our reception or recognition and reception of the uncreated God. And so when we talk about freedom, we've talked about it as a kind of baseline, a kind of ambivalence of choice. So you could choose this or you could choose that, or a kind of on-off switch, like you can exercise agency or not, but which stands in need of maturation. You don't want to just, toggle between on and off willy-nilly, nor do you want to just choose between this and that arbitrarily. You want to do so in accord with what is good, right? So it means a living engagement with the good. And when we're talking about the good in this circumstance, we're talking about God, right? So ultimately, the standard, the paradigm according to which we choose whether something corresponds to our human nature or not, whether something represents our flourishing or not is whether it's in God, whether it can be had in God. Because if not, then it's not for us. So I think that freedom, in part, it helps to clarify, and then it helps to simplify in a certain sort, or in a certain sense, our embrace, or our kind of like beholding and embracing of God. So I would think that it's kind of part of this aspect of created beatitude when it attains to its fullness, when it attains to its height. But then as concerns like, means, when we talk about the soul acting through powers, we're talking about specifically the power of will, which, because of its ambivalence, we describe as free choice. That's a kind of means, right, as it were, to the acquisition of goods, or it's the baseline upon which, or the basis upon which we then build to this beatitude. So yeah, something like that.
I'm thinking if there is something like a capital F freedom, in the sense that our Lord referenced when he said the truth will set you free. So the truth being him, an encounter with him, a cooperation with him, and his the truth that he reveals to us and that he invites us into, it will then set you free. It's almost like our discipleship with him is a means to our fulfillment in freedom, which is a kind of perfection or a kind of beatitude. Do you think that's accurate? Or yeah, okay.
No, I think like freedom always entails some kind of apprenticeship, because I'm thinking about just practical reason in general, the way that Aristotle describes it. He says, what's it going to look like for us to do something prudently, or in a way that's practically wise? Well, he said, like, look at the wise man. That's a decent indication of what you ought to do, because there's so much that goes into our exercise of moral agency, and the circumstances really shade many of our decisions in a way that can't be foreseen, or it can't be accounted for except in the moment. And so you're seeking to cultivate a kind of moral maturity whereby you become a virtuoso. Like when you watch people play sports really, really well, like I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan, and their quarterback is this guy named Jalen Hurts, and he's a really talented athlete. And they say that he's a triple threat because he can beat you with his legs, he can beat you with his arm, and he can beat you with his mind. So he's anticipated so many things about your defensive scheme that he's able to pick you apart in a way that you didn't know you were even vulnerable to. But then he's just a freak athlete. He's just super talented. So he can throw the ball exactly where he wants it, and he can put himself exactly where he wants to be on the field. But when you watch that, like, how did that come to be? Well, this man spends an incredible amount of time in the gym. He can squat over 600 pounds. That's a lot of weight. So it's not by magic that you see him, exercise a kind of wizardry on the field. There's a lot of like the rudiments. There's a lot of the exercise. There's a lot of the training and practice that has gone into that, and last year he had a breakout year because it was the first time that he was working under the same offensive coordinator in like 7 or 8 years, basically since high school, because he had been changing OCs every year. And then he had some stability. He had some solid apprenticeship, and you just saw him flourish. So I think that like our freedom always involves putting in the work, taking the time, like working, as it were, through the rudiments or the steps to moral maturation, but in a relationship to somebody who can see with a broader range of vision, perhaps, or a kind of expert's range of vision, who can help to educate us in the freedom which he himself beholds. And so, yeah, I think that this paradigm of discipleship is exactly what we want, because we're looking to the wise man, not just in the mundane sense of wise, but in the transcendent sense of wise, because it pertains to the wise to order things well. And what we want is our lives to be ordered well. We want to enshrine those goods which are highest in a way that's highest, and we want to enshrine those goods which are subordinate in a way that's subordinate. So, yes.
I like that you're referencing Aristotle in that sense, or about that particular insight. But I also struggle with it in our particular, like this contemporary moment that these generations who are alive now are living through. Because on the one hand, so many of us struggle to know what is good and what is right. If we can return to the simulation analogy or the video game analogy, where you've been dropped into a world and you have to go explore, and instead of like having some breathing room, it's like every single character in the story comes up to you and says, go this way, no, go that way, no, come this way, no, I've got something for you. It's like, oh my goodness, how do I know who to follow right now? It seems to me that that's the world that we live in. It's pulling us in a million different directions, and it seems to be a lot of people are just desperate for clarity, for a voice who can actually articulate, for a voice crying out in the wilderness to say, this is the real path. But how do you recognize it when it appears? How do you know who the wise man is that you can model your life after? And one of the dangers that exists out there that I see a lot, and we hear about people who have been raised in a Catholic family, a good Christian family, who then go off to university and they stray fairly quickly. And my impression of what happens a lot of the time is that they encounter professionals who are knowledgeable, who are intellectuals, who are impressive in their teachers, right? In their professors. And they're hearing them lecture every day. And this is probably the most impressive intellectual formation they've ever witnessed and partaken in. And when those professors do not sympathize with their Christian upbringing, it's very persuasive for them to say, there's the wise man. There's one I want to follow. And I don't think we need Aristotle to tell us that, if you want to grow in virtue, look to the virtuous person or look to the wise man. I think we intuitively do that. We're always looking for people that we can model our lives after. And when we don't have it, we just resort to idolatry of celebrity or something like that, right? So we're very eager to find those examples, but there are dangerous examples out there. And so, what advice would you give to other parents who are maybe apprehensively sending their kids in that direction, or to just anybody in general, including college students, who are finding themselves in that situation where the wise man appears to be their professor and he doesn't sympathize with Catholicism?
Yeah. I've been thinking about this. I don't know if I've been thinking about it well, but I've been thinking about it a lot, which whatever that's worth.
Mm-hmm.
Like the degree of stricture that a parent places upon the child up until the age of whatever it is, 18 or 22. Because on the one hand, you can feel the tension. On the one hand, you want the child to freely embrace the good, because the child is going to retain those things over which he himself feels a kind of competence, or in which he feels himself a kind of protagonist. If he feels constrained to or limited to the choice of this or that, he might begin to resent it, because that seems to be the trajectory of post-fallen man. And so you as a parent want to propose the good to your child, but you're also going to baptize your child just as soon as you can, right? Because you're not going to be like, well, I want my child to choose the faith for himself. It's like, that's nuts, because what we're talking about here is salvation, and you're not going to deprive your child of salvation just because you want to reverence his inadequately formed will. It's like, yeah. So there are certain goods which are so good that you just don't want. Yeah, you just don't want your child coming in contact with potential obstacles, or you want to expose your child to the things that are going to furnish him with eternal life. So I think about this with respect to pornography, for instance. Like, the home should be a place that is safe from pornography.
Sure.
It just should be a place that is safe from pornography. But then the question is, do you insist on that for the houses that your child will visit?
I do. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
Some parents do, some parents don't, because they're worried that limiting their child's contact, that they might, the child might resent the fact that not able to go over to this friend's house, blah, blah, blah. There are workarounds, your house can become an especially fun place, and you can get a foosball table and everyone will want to come over to your house regardless. But all these questions you answer these questions in real time. They're not just theoretical questions. They're just they're questions that come at you on the daily basis.
Yeah.
And so, when it comes to the wise man, I think that's something that I was furnished with as a child was exposure to saints. Like, my mother didn't really read much, and I didn't see my mother pray a ton, but my mother always read me saint stories. And I remember having my mother read me the story of Saint Tarcisius, this child saint who died for love of the Eucharist. And that being very, very impressive. I was like, holy smokes, I want to love Jesus like that. I don't even know how to love Jesus like that, but somebody else loved Jesus like that. And so it's possible to love Jesus like that. So yeah, whatever the next step is, I'll take it. But it was my mother who exposed me to that. My mother, who every time we went to adoration as a family fell asleep. Every time my dad proposed praying the rosary together, she'd be like, I just got to get one more thing done. My mom wasn't an impious woman. She was in her own way, very she was a daily communicant and things like that. But she wasn't your kind of standard contemplative. And yet, she really loved the saints. And I think that my exposure to the lives of the saints, it gave me these moral witnesses, these moral sages, in effect, that oriented my vision. I went to Steubenville, and it's good luck finding a bad example at Steubenville. I I commend you the effort. But yeah, had I gone to secular university, of who gives a rip, I think that would have furnished me with a lot in terms of sorting my way out between the good and the bad. So yeah, it's just tough.
I think another part of the challenge to this too, insofar as it relates to parents and their kids, and it reminds me too that I'm grateful. I'm very, very grateful for the fact that we're able to homeschool our kids, and not just for the fact that we're protecting them and insulating them from the evils of the world, but also because we're able to educate them in things that public schools refuse to do today. So, as a publicly schooled person myself, I wasn't exposed to anything philosophical. I remember watching The Matrix for the first time and being like, wow, philosophical ideas? This is insane. I've never encountered something like this. So that, again, by the time that you go off to university, it's the first time you're hearing this stuff, and it's impressive. And it's not even necessarily very deep. It could just be in your sociology class or something like that, right? Or something you read in your literature class, and you're like, wow, this is a new level of brilliance. And I never encountered this in my upbringing. But for us, and many of the families that we homeschool with, like our kids are reading good texts, and not just sort of nonfiction philosophy or dialectic, but they're reading good biographies and history books and lives of the saints and these kinds of things. So that I hope that by the time they go off to university, for those that do, they're not going to be that impressed by their kind of basic atheistic humanities professor. So it seems to me that we need to do more as a church to expose our kids to the wise man, so that they're less impressed, I think, by the time they get off to university. I don't know if you think that that's a more pragmatic approach to things, if we can return
I think too, we talked about this actually when we did the episode for Godsplaining, or maybe it was after we pushed stop record. But how the internet doesn't really conduce to wisdom too terribly well.
No.
Because of its algorithmic slavery, and those things tend to get most clicks, which are posed in most occasional and incendiary terms. But I think that like something very precious that we can do in the 21st century is, to the degree that it's possible, transcend the spin, cut through the spin, and give people, furnish people with principles and with arguments for life. And when I say principles and arguments, I mean that both intellectually and volitionally. Like, you give people a witness which is coherent, which helps them to draw the connections between the principles and the arguments and the conclusions, so that they can see, it's possible to live a coherent life. And this is maybe one version of what it looks like. Because otherwise it's just shout this, shout that by way of contrariety. And in that event, I think that you are really exposed to, or made vulnerable to, a potentially false, like Ersatz wise character.
Yeah. I want to talk about free will a little bit, because this is a concept that appears a lot, and I don't feel like everybody has a very strong grasp of it, and I would kind of put myself in that camp as well. So maybe some preliminary questions would be, is free will synonymous with freedom? Are we saying the same thing there? And is it also distinct from will? Do we have a will and we also have a free will? Are we saying more about our will, or is it redundant to say I have a free will, because presumably with your will you have some measure of freedom?
Yeah, so I tend to use them interchangeably. I think the most ancient formulation is typically free choice, and then I think free will, it's not like it names a new faculty, but it gets us back to the faculty of the will from which issues free choice. And that, like the free signifies both the on off and the from this vantage, from that vantage. So I think that free choice, free will, or like human will or intellectual appetite, they get you the same reality, but from different vantages, whether as the power of the soul, or the faculty as it's sometimes called, or as the activity thereof, identified from one or another of the main handles that we grip it with.
Okay. I know we're running out of time here, so I want to ask you quickly, how can people follow what you're up to? What kinds of things are you up to these days? And if we have time, I've got another bonus question I want to ask you after this. But
nice.
Share a little bit about what you're up to these days for those who are interested.
Yeah, so I just got back from Switzerland. I'm assigned now in the United States, in Washington, D.C. I teach at the Dominican House of Studies. I teach dogmatic and moral theology. And then I work for the Thomistic Institute. And things at the Thomistic Institute are still humming along. So we have the lectures and the retreats and the conferences, and then Aquinas 101, which has been ongoing now for maybe 4 years, which is pretty wild to think about. I bet it's wild for me, but I'm one of the few people in the world that thinks about it on a regular basis. But Aquinas 101 is actually launching a new learning platform. So like a lot of these college learning platforms whereby you can track your progress with particular courses and just kind of check in a way that holds you more accountable and like kind of gives you a better interface with the thing itself. That's due for the end of November. So I think, that'll be really cool. And I think people will profit from that. And then
where can
on the
people
side,
find that?
Oh yeah. So you can find that at aquinas101.com, which will direct you to the pertinent place on the Thomistic Institute website.
Okay.
So yeah, and it's going to launch in English, and then we've begun developing sites in French, Spanish, and Portuguese, which are our like kind of biggest foreign language followings. The Portuguese especially the Brazilian Portuguese, are just devouring Aquinas like he's going out of style. So,
wow. That's good news.
It is. And as Taylor Swift once sang, he'll never go out of style. He'll never go out of style. Or something like that. Hey, she's a big deal now because she's going to NFL games. Regardless. And then I'm still contributing to the podcast, Godsplaining, and Catholic Classics. We just launched a new season of Catholic Classics, which is read a classic classic text of Christianity and then comment it. So this season is on the Confessions of St. Augustine.
Awesome. Okay, so with as much time as you feel like you have left, I wanted to ask you about St. Thomas Aquinas, because in spite of what Taylor Swift might say, he does seem to go in and out of fashion, and with certain measures of hostility when he does go out of fashion. It seems to be, it's not by him just sort of fading into obscurity. It's like people want to displace him at times. And it seems like almost there are rhythms within the church and its history that correlate to where St. Thomas is, in whether he's in vogue or he's not in vogue. Obviously not going through the entire history, but ever since his time as a teacher and now a saint and doctor. I was in a conversation with somebody recently in which we were both self-identified Orthodox faithful Catholics. I think we would agree that that's true. But even then, we run into disagreements about certain things. And to bolster my position, I quoted St. Thomas like word for word in defense of what it was that I said. And it was almost celebratory for him, because he was like, well, St. Thomas Aquinas. He's good. Don't get me wrong. He's a doctor. He's a saint, whatever. But I don't know. That guy said some pretty weird things, and I don't give him a lot of credibility. And I'm more interested in other theologians that he might have named. And what do you say to people like that, or to what degree of authority does St. Thomas actually carry? On the one hand, he's very easy to reference because he talks about such a vast number of things, but often people will just dismiss him and say, well, that's not magisterial, or I don't have to, just because he's a saint doesn't mean I have to treat his thought as if it's Catholic teaching. Why should we take St. Thomas more seriously than our own opinions, or maybe even just modern theologians?
Yeah, maybe just to kind of tie it back in to one of the themes, I think we should follow St. Thomas as a teacher because he's wise. Because the church in her magisterial teaching has relied upon St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas with great frequency, because the church has taken the philosophy which underwrites his theology as a kind of perennial philosophy for the enunciation of many of her teachings. And because St. Thomas is also, like, in being wise, he's also a good preacher and teacher, and he educates us in the scripture and the tradition in a way that makes life clearer, I suppose, or maybe more coherent. And so that all being said, I typically don't argue from authority with St. Thomas Aquinas. Not that many people do, but I find that the argument that leads with, well, St. Thomas says, comma, ... often it tends to alienate or isolate rather than commend or, commend the teaching or convince the auditor. So what I typically do is I'll just exposit the teaching, and I'll help people to see the principles and then to walk through the arguments, and then hopefully to draw the conclusions. I'll associate it with St. Thomas at a certain point, but it's just by way of attribution, so that I'm not accused of intellectual plagiarism, although I try to identify at every opportunity as a hack Thomist, as one with no real original thoughts, just a kind of purveyor of the half digested or even misdigested thoughts of St. Thomas. But I even think in that, like it's a great mercy that you can only partially understand a great teacher and still profit immensely from it. So I think that the proof's in the pudding, and the pudding is in our own. So if I say preaching and teaching from the side of St. Thomas, I think for us, like the pertinent disciplines are, like education and also transformation. It ought ultimately to translate to the renewal of our minds in the Pauline sense of that term, and like metanoia in the New Testament sense of that term. So yeah, that'd be just a little bit of a sketch as to why I think St. Thomas remains the common doctor even 750 years after his death, and why the Church continues to speak in like a very much Thomistic paradigm or idiom in the explication of her teaching and preaching.
Great. Well, Father Gregory Pine, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. And for those of you that are watching, thanks for joining and tuning in. And God willing, we will see you again soon.
All right. Cheers.
All right. Thanks, Father Gregory.
Hey, my joy.
Hey, thanks for watching that. If you made it this far, it's either because you fell asleep or because you really like me. And if it's the latter, I feel okay asking if you would consider helping me out by subscribing, liking, sharing, and if you really like me, consider supporting my channel by joining the reinforcements, where you can get opportunities to interact with me and others personally. You can sign up at brianholdsworth.ca. And if you're looking to buy or move, consider using Real Estate for Life. They are a network of real estate agents that will share your pro-life and pro-family beliefs, which are pretty important when it comes to making a big decision like finding a house. You can find them at realestateforlife.com.